Hi, welcome to 10 by 6. Dr. Deepa Driver. I'm just going to introduce to the readers your formal title, if that's okay. So we've got you're into free speech and protecting whistleblowers, which is really key to what we're talking about today, because obviously our focus is on Craig Murray and his imprisonment in Scotland and the details that surround that. And you're also a legal observer in the Julian Assange case, which I think is also really, really important. So you're an academic and you teach in universities. So you've got a wide knowledge and understanding around both cases, both in terms of Julian Assange and in terms of Craig Murray. So there's a sort of set of questions I sort of want to ask you today about the history relating to Craig. And also some of the implications, if that's okay.
Certainly. Thanks very much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
No, it's absolutely our pleasure. It really is our pleasure. So Craig Murray, for anybody who doesn't know, is the former ambassador of Uzbekistan. He's also a father of a newborn child, and he's not very well, and he hasn't been very well for quite a while. He's got no prior convictions. And yet somehow at the moment he finds himself on an 8-month sentence in a Scottish prison. So Deepa, can you sort of give us some context as to why that is?
Sure. So like you said, Craig's a whistleblower. He was Britain's former ambassador to Uzbekistan, where he revealed exceedingly horrific torture that Britain was turning a blind eye to. He was also important or key in revealing that MI6 were coordinating with the CIA in that they were using evidence obtained under torture. And this was, this really put the Blair government's nose out of joint. And they sought to persecute Murray. Murray won his investigation. And since then, he left the civil service and has been on has been really the eyes and ears of ordinary people trying to understand what's going on in the world, particularly more recently in the case of Alex Salmond and in the case of Julian Assange. Craig's a vociferous supporter of Scottish independence. And as a result, he's very well respected, not just by those within the free speech and whistleblower communities, but also those within the establishment who rely upon Craig in various circumstances for advice and guidance.
Okay, so he turned himself into the police last week, having been found guilty in a Scottish court. Yeah. So what is it that they're saying he did wrong?
Yes, so just for those of you who weren't there at that wonderful kind of poignant moment where Craig was turned himself into the Scottish prison, or rather to the Scottish police station. Yes. There was an entire group of supporters who were there singing Auld Lang Syne, and not a dry eye in sight. There's a little video of it online if your viewers would like to watch. And the reason so many people came out in defense of Craig and have, ranging from former MEPs, UN voices, people all over the world, important critical voices have come out in support of Craig, is because this case really seems like a part of an establishment effort to kill independent journalism, to silence it, to silence critical voices. And that's why people like me are deeply concerned about the case. What happened was that Alex Salmond, the former First Minister of Scotland, was targeted in what he, I believe, mentioned as a politically motivated prosecution. And of course, that comment of his was upheld by the High Court because, not the comment in itself, but his concerns were upheld because he was given vast amounts of compensation because of the way in which the investigation into Salmond was carried out. This investigation related to 14 charges of sexual assault or harassment, and it was tried by a majority female jury. And this is quite important in that having a jury trial in such cases where you have sexual assault victims is potentially no longer going to be the case, because Lady Dorian, who presided over Alex Salmond's case and also was the judge presiding over the contempt of case in court hearing for Craig, she was one of the people, or rather at the helm of the people involved in ensuring that going forward, they do not wish to have jury trials in these cases. So Alex's case was heard, evidence came to light, including in something that was read into the record by David Davis in Westminster using parliamentary privilege, to show that there had been an effort by certain elements of the SNP leadership, Peter Murrell, Sue Riddick and others, it was quite shocking news, actually. Texts and emails revealed that they had been trying to encourage complainants against Alex Salmond. And alongside this, at the time that this was happening and people were mentioning it, MSPs were mentioning it, Alex Salmond was worried about the way in which he was being kind of pushed out of public life. And given there is a sexual assault trial, a lot of the sympathies, quite rightly, and the concerns, quite rightly, are with the persons who are survivors of harassment rather than the person who's accused.
Yes.
And so Salmond was very concerned that the mainstream media in particular was reporting the prosecution side of the case, or was going to be reporting the prosecution side of the information, and there would be nobody to report the defense side. And so Craig was invited by Alex Salmond to talk to him about this, primarily because Craig had no prior, I believe, close relationship with Salmond, just because he was one of the independence bloggers and was known to be fair-minded. Anyway, this Craig then reported on Alex's trial. The first 7 days of the trial, if I'm not mistaken, of Alex Salmond's trial, the public was excluded from the public gallery because of the intention to protect the protected witnesses. And the conclusion of the trial, to cut a long story short, because we are in 10 by 6, it was that Alex was acquitted of all charges. So a majority female jury acquitted Salmond of all charges, and Salmond also won several £100,000 in relation to a political motivated prosecution separately. So given these were the case, when the trial concluded, Craig was charged with contempt of court. Now you have to think about this in the context of the fact that the Lord Advocate in Scotland, here in Britain, in England, we have the separation of the judiciary from the executive. But in Scotland, the Lord Advocate is a member of Nicola Sturgeon's cabinet. And therefore, when such a prosecution is taken, there are serious concerns about the motivations of those involved and whether they will really speak up, given there is no separation of powers. Thereafter, this contempt of court case was heard by Lady Dorian and 2 other judges. And the primary premise of the case, in addition to a number of other things which were not upheld, was something called Jigsaw Identification. And this Jigsaw Identification is a very unusual beast. Firstly, it's important to remember that a contempt of court trial has no jury. So this is judges who had previously, or at least one of whom had previously presided over Salmond's case, now saying, you disrespected my authority, and therefore you're being, we are judging whether you're in contempt of court.
Yes.
Right. So it's not that the judge is initiating the prosecution, obviously not. That's what the prosecution, the Lord Advocate, etc., is initiating. But what I'm saying is that it is a question of disrespect to the judgment of the same judge. Right. And then you have a situation where this judge is now saying, has Craig Murray done anything which would vitiate my decision that the identities of the witnesses should be protected. And it is here that the Jigsaw identification comes in, and this relates to the charges against Murray related to information that he had put in before the court order even came in, right? So in January. So this, the way Jigsaw identification works is the expectation is that each of us has different pieces of the puzzle, and sometimes somebody reveals something that allows us to put our pieces together with theirs to identify someone. Now, in the case of Jigsaw identification, you can imagine, as in any jigsaw, you as a person revealing information, say you're reporting on the defense case, irrespective of what you report, right? You can disclose information that you don't know what other pieces other people hold. You don't know what the general public holds. And the expectation is that your little piece helps them to figure out who it is. And what is really, really dangerous about Craig's case is that the judge held the threshold was not just the general public who gained information, which you as a journalist or blogger will know is in the public domain. This could be people who are experts, people who are who understand what's going on, who are close to the complainant, who have information that you don't even know they possess. And were you to disclose anything, that would be termed as Jigsaw identification. So this is generally Jigsaw identification, which in itself is a really dangerous concept because it can be used to stitch up dissidents, is something that is now being interpreted in a very, very wide way, in that not just members of the general public, which would be the narrow interpretation that the defense suggested, but a very wide interpretation, which is even experts who know other facts, who may be close to the SNP leadership, for example, would be able to identify the complainants. And using that threshold, Craig was convicted. What's interesting is Craig still doesn't know whom he identified and in relation to what. So that's never been made clear. What's also interesting is that the judgment draws a very, very dangerous difference between mainstream journalists and all other independent journalists, suggesting, and you and I know what we think of Peston and Laura Kuenssberg and their adherence to codes of conduct, and any of these other mainstream journalists who are who we see doing things that really worry us. And apparently these mainstream journalists are in a better category because they sign up to Ipsos code of conduct, whereas people like Craig are held to a different standard because they are independent journalists. Now, in all of this,
can I ask you, is there also an issue with the NUJ? Because they seem to be rather complicit in this too.
Well, the NUJ, I mean, it's been really disappointing. On the Assange side, it's taken a huge amount of time for the NUJ, and they have, and this is huge credit to them. They finally come out defending Assange and opposing his extradition. But on Craig Murray's side, Craig's application has been to be an NUJ member. He was previously an NUJ member as a freelancer, and they had to prove some income threshold. And I know I've looked at those thresholds in order to be a full-time NUJ member, in terms of where your income comes from, et cetera, whether it comes largely from journalism or otherwise. And this kind of, they took about 6 months to look at his application. He was then in a situation where he thought his application had been approved because that was what was informally indicated to him. And then he later found out, at the time he found out that there had been an objection against him. And the NUJ, after another few months, declined his application. And the NUJ, I'm a trade unionist, and I would never down another trade union, because we do need the trade unions to show support with solidarity with the working class. And the NEJ does good work supporting some independent journalists and having an independent journalist element. But in Craig's case, it's been really worrying that, you know, the way in which the process has been carried out, which suggests that a range of interests have acted against him. I think some of them have been motivated very positively by people who are genuinely concerned about not associating, say, anybody with those who are subject to various proceedings. But also, I mean, I don't know if the NEJ took this into consideration, but there are also other motives that I can see in the horizon, which are around, you know, what kinds of support we give to visible dissidents. And Craig's definitely in that category of visible dissidents, because you can see that part of the, you know, in this contempt case, when Craig was convicted, one of the things that was very dangerous for the Assange case is there's a case currently happening in Spain in relation to Assange, in relation to the spying on Assange, in relation to the spying on the legally privileged conversations. We have extensive video evidence that UC Global, a company run by Sheldon Adelson, who runs the casinos in Las Vegas and who recently died, and who was a funder of Trump, Sheldon Adelson was funding UC Global, or rather money was being channeled through Sheldon Adelson's casinos to fund on the spying of Assange, which then went back to the CIA, etc. So this case is being held in Spain, and Craig was an important witness in this case. Yeah. And he was, as a result of the contempt of court conviction, he was required to surrender his passport, even though he was at that time not in prison, not allowed to go to Spain to testify in person in that trial. So there's a lot of things, you know, Craig's support for Assange is definitely something that has come back to bite him. And I think he's very proud of that in some ways. His support for independence, which again is a thorn in the side of the British establishment, definitely a thorn in the side of Nicola Sturgeon's government, because of the fact that Alex Salmond, you know, was intending a return back to politics because he was unhappy with the way the SNP establishment was using funds allocated for independence or collected for the independence movement and pursuing the independence goal. So there's a lot of different moving negative parts, all of which have coalesced, including, you know, of course, the concern that the judge, Lady Dorian, is one of the prime proponents of this desire to have jury-free trials for sexual assault witnesses. So these are all the things happening in the background. We don't know how or whether each of them had an impact on where Craig is at. But the other really dangerous thing about this is Tommy Robinson, when he was first done for contempt of court and subsequently done further for, you know, directly harassing people. And that's in England, of course, different court system to that in Scotland.
Yes.
Is somebody who was initially, you know, given a non-custodial order, and then in the other two cases given nine months in total for two cases where he directly identified witnesses. This is Stephen Yaxley Lennon, of the English Defence League. In Scotland, for the last 40 years, nobody's been jailed in the way that Craig has been done. And Jigsaw Identification, again, is something that is that nobody's ever served jail time for, I believe, in the last however many years. And so this is a situation where we have, prior to this, a situation where in Britain and elsewhere, we have gay people being persecuted for being homosexual, women being persecuted for having abortions. And those kinds of things, that is the ethics and the culture of the era in which these kinds of prosecutions previously took place. And now we have a completely different, I would hope, set of values in some ways. And in this set of values, somebody who's an honest, truth-telling journalist, who doesn't even know whom he has identified, who has explained and provided affidavits to show that he took great pains to not make sure the protected witness weren't identified, despite whatever he might have had feelings about, the conspiracy surrounding Alex Salmonds' stitch up. You now have a situation where this Craig is now in prison. He's a recent father of a 4-month-old child. He has very severe pulmonary disease. And this is the amusing thing, which I suspect your viewers might really want to know, which is, they declined to allow Craig to do community service, citing his health, saying he wanted to do some community service with refugees. And they said, oh, your health is not good enough to do this. But then they decided to give him an 8-month prison sentence. And you just think, this is unbelievable. It doesn't happen. But actually it has happened. You see a journalist in prison in Belmarsh for 2 years, and more recently, for the last 7-odd months, having won his case against extradition. He's still in prison, in a maximum security prison where, we typically condemn those who are accused of the most serious offences. And this is a parallel is happening in Scotland, which is why this Scotland jails journalist hashtag really took off if you looked on social media, because people feel really vexed at the way in which Craig has been prosecuted and stitched up. And it's very sad to see this man in prison. Sorry, I've gone on a bit.
No, not at all. Thank you, Deepa. Just to finish off in terms of Craig, how would you summarise, both in Scotland and across the United Kingdom, how would you summarise the role of the corporate media in this? I mean, have they yet again negated their duty to cover this case or a case of this type as they should? Or have there been certain elements of the corporate media who have done a better job than others? And in terms of both Scotland and, as I say, further afield, or even internationally?
Well, it's very interesting that, when we looked at the evidence from Panel-Based, which is one of the market researchers, which was employed to see whom did people get information from in relation to Alex Salmonds' case, where they felt they could identify witnesses. The corporate media journalist, Danny Garavelli, was the one who was cited 4 times more than, I believe, Craig or anybody else. And so the corporate media has, in the Salmonds case, covered the prosecution case extensively and stayed silent on the defense case. So the lack of balance is something that we can see, and I can see that, of course, in Julian Assange's case, where the corporate media, which benefited hugely financially from the kinds of revelations that they were able to put out on the back of WikiLeaks releases, then and I condemn the Guardian explicitly in this, ran a vicious campaign against Assange. I'm really, I guess, on the Scottish side, I don't live in Scotland, so I don't read as much of the Scottish media as others, so I'm not able to give a holistic opinion. But I am interested that the mainstream journalists seem to take pride in this privilege that they have, that they are in some way better than bloggers and independent journalists, when we know it's actually independent journalists who put their necks on the line to reveal some of the most key stories, which then the corporate media then pulls off, or sometimes acknowledging them and sometimes not acknowledging them, and then reuses. So I don't think the corporate media has much to say. What's also interesting in Craig's case is Alex Salmonds' barrister was recorded on a train mentioning the names of the witnesses. It is difficult to say, make a judgment what piece of information is in somebody else's head somewhere else. And this behavior, this way of treating a journalist, to me is really despicable.
Thank you. It's always beyond words in terms of trying to summarize the situation for Craig. So I won't even attempt it. Can we just finally move on, just to maybe give an update in terms of Julian Assange and what's happening in relation to him?
Yeah, Julian's case is one that I feel very close to. I've been following it very closely for the last 2 years. and have been the legal observer at his hearings, extradition hearings. The case has been tainted from the start by a complete and utter lack of due process, both in the way in which Julian was removed from the Ecuadorian embassy and Britain's complicity in breaching a sovereign nation's embassy in order, through an IMF loan, which was sanctioned to Lenin Moreno's government. And, Alan Duncan has said in his memoirs how proud he is of the way in which they helped coordinate for the right-wing Ecuadorian Lenin Moreno government to allow them to go inside and drag Julian out of the embassy, where he was, as a citizen of Ecuador, granted asylum. He was granted asylum and then he had citizenship. So Ecuadorian citizenship cannot be taken off without due process. And in Julian's case, you can see that due process was never carried out, because Ecuador has now, just in the last month or so, carried out another process to deprive Julian of his citizenship. So he was still, they didn't use the citizenship process correctly. They didn't use the refugee status correctly. Julian was dragged out. He went through a court process where, there are police complaints in place at the moment in relation to misfeasance in public office by the judges, who did not take into account the threats to Julian's life, which they were aware of, and who, you see in this judges, Julian says his name and his date of birth, and the judge categorizes him as arrogant. And this kind of way in which Julian went through the process, where we go through the extradition trial, you go to Westminster Magistrates Court, and I've queued at very odd hours in the early morning to get into court. And you see how the judge says things like, oh, the government wants to pursue this case quickly, where we expect a separation of duties between the judges and the executive. And we're also concerned about the exclusion of human rights observers, of political observers, of legal observers from the actual final stage of the trial, which was at the Old Bailey, where we were 40 accredited organizations, including Amnesty, who thought they had access to the trial until the very day we suddenly had their access removed. And 2 places were allowed. I queued for one of those 2 places alongside, with the help of grassroots supporters who've been absolutely brilliant in supporting Julian through this horrific time, to get into court, where there are, across the 2 courts, there were 46 odd seats, if not more. And, in the morning, 2 of us were allowed in. This is just, and, the idea that you have a part of your fair trial rights are to have, the public present, firstly, to provide a countervailing factor to the biased judges, but also to have open justice. This was, completely negated in Julian's case, and the mainstream media was completely silent about the fact that all these organizations had been excluded, or that the public gallery was so limited. Talk about COVID. I mean, COVID, if you have 33 seats and you allow 2 people in each gallery, what's that, 33 and 33, 66, you still cannot justify having only 2 people in one of the galleries, even if you say 1 in 3 seats are used. And so now Julian won that case against all odds within a judgment where the judge essentially criminalized whistleblowing in journalism in the UK. And despite that, because of the conditions under which he will be held in US prisons, and the fact that he faces a 175-year prison sentence, and the fact that he's likely to commit suicide were he to be extradited to the United States, the judge decided against extradition. And the US then, see, all of this is punishment through process for Julian. He's had 10 years of being deprived of his liberty, 10 years of being deprived of sunlight in a person who has osteoporosis, right? And who snaps a rib tying his shoelaces. And this person is now who's being psychologically tortured by the arbitrariness of the process, because anybody who wins a case expects to be set free. And in this case, they say, oh, you win the case, we'll still keep you in prison. And that's where the US is now trying to extend that prison time without due cause by saying, okay, we will appeal the grounds on which so the appeal of the US was allowed. against Julian's non-extradition, but certain grounds were not allowed. And now the case on the 11th of August, for those of you who would like to come, it's at the High Court, the Royal Courts of Justice, 9 a.m. on the 11th of August in London. Please come and, oppose this kind of stitch up of a journalist and whistleblower who, to this day, WikiLeaks has a 100% record of accuracy, who published the truth about serious and dangerous war crimes where ordinary children, women, men were, just wiped out in horrific incidents. And this person is being prosecuted, and the US is now trying to say, oh, we want to further question some of the grounds under which the appeal was allowed. And this is the Biden administration going down the same path as the Trump administration. They're no different from each other. They're all doing the same thing, which is to suppress whistleblowing and suppress journalism. So please come and oppose this. And the British state is wholly complicit. The Metropolitan Police in particular should hang its head in shame in the way it spied on supporters, was complicit in the spying on Julian. And the way in which they have conducted themselves through this shows how, the spy cops things that we have seen before, and which we all take a very strong stance against, is resurfacing here, and it's not gone away. That stench is still there, and the Met Police is at the center of that stench.
Thank you, Deepa. We have two cases here that seem to have a huge amount of crossover. I'm going to leave the viewers to take the information and to chew it over in their minds and to make their own decisions, because there are so many suppositions that we can also make as to why this is happening and who's dictating it. But I think that would undermine everything that you've said, because I think we need to stick closely to the facts and allow others to use those facts to dig deeper and go further. Thank you so much for coming on the program today. It's been riveting in terms, it's depressing, but it's riveting in terms of exposing what's happened in case of two people who all they wanted to do was to expose the truth. Thank you so much for coming on 10 by 6. Thank you, Deepa.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here because I think more people need to know what's going on. We're also, most of us are struggling with work due to COVID, or with family commitments, children at home, all that kind of thing. And a lot of people who are struggling financially because of the way this government is dealing with support services, etc., etc. And so, all this is happening in the background, and the world seems a very dangerous and dark place. But I think we all must take some amount of courage and strength from people like Craig and Julian, who are still choosing to do what's right. And you see this in the case of the Bupa whistleblowers, the 7 people who showed how, a 90-odd-year-old woman was being abused in a care home, through to other whistleblowers today. Whistleblowers are not necessarily people high profile like Craig or Julian, but are ordinary people like you and me who come forward because we cannot stand the injustice and we know it's wrong. And I guess 80%, 90% of people stay quiet and think, oh, well, I can't do anything about it. But once in a while, each of us thinks the line has been crossed and we stand up and we say something. And places like WikiLeaks are important because they allow those like us who want to be anonymous, who can't take the risks of losing our job, being put in prison, whatever else, to say what we have to say and provide information to allow the system to be better. Because that's what whistleblowers are. Whistleblowers like Craig are people who genuinely believe that the system should work the way it should. And they are revealing elements of information where the system is breaking down. And that's what many ordinary people see in their daily life. We see the effects of that system breaking down, whether it's in our parents in care homes, whether it's children in care, whether it is, the health service and corruption with the Tory government in place. All these kinds of things are happening. And only the people who are behind the scenes can know what's really going on, whether it's, corporations dumping asbestos somewhere or polluting the waters. So if you are somebody who cares passionately, if you are an activist, you should care about the cases of Julian and Craig, because it's these kinds of cases that set the grounds for us to have any activism, for us to do anything. Unless the whistleblowers come forward, all these corporations, all these governments are opaque, and we need to support them, and we need to come forward.
Yeah,
so
absolutely, a strength in truth. Thank you so much. Thank you.